Beneath the Backcountry by P.J. Taylor. Chapter 3. The air in Echo Station was brittle the next morning. Nobody laughed over breakfast. Nobody even talked. The scrambled eggs cooled on James's plate as he stared at the muted radio sitting on the counter, its silence heavier than any blizzard. Thomas stood by the mapboard with his arms crossed, studying the valleys eastward. Pine Hollow Station was a tiny speck of ink between contour lines, 15 miles through steep country, half of it unmaintained trail. Normally, that trek was a 2-day patrol with camping in between. But now, they didn't have 2 days. "Radio's still dead," Isabel reported, dropping into a chair. Her face was tight, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "No word from Morgan or anyone else," Kyle muttered. "Probably a busted antenna." But his voice lacked conviction. James looked at Thomas. "We heading out?" Thomas's eyes didn't move from the map. "Not all of us." He finally turned, gaze sweeping the group. "We can't abandon Echo. If something happens here while we're gone, it'll be worse than Pine Hollow going dark." The room went still. Sam set down his mug with a hard clink. "So we just let them sit out there? Maybe bleeding, maybe worse?" "No," Thomas said flatly. "I'll take a team. James, Isabel, Evan, you're with me. The rest stay here. Hold the fort. Keep the line open. If we don't check in by midnight, you call search and rescue, and anyone else who'll listen." Nobody argued. James felt both relief and dread coiled together in his stomach. Relief because he trusted Thomas more than anyone to lead. Dread because Evan was coming too. He hadn't shaken the image from 2 nights ago. Evan's pale eyes in the lamplight, his voice low as he asked Thomas about survivors. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was seeing patterns in the shadows. But James's gut twisted. Every time Evan moved, and in the backcountry, gut feelings kept you alive. They set out by mid-morning, packs loaded, rifles slung across their shoulders. The forest was damp from the storm, branches dripping overhead. Every footstep squelched in the sodden earth. James led for the first stretch, his compass swinging steadily as he followed the faint cut of an old service trail. The wilderness pressed close around them, towering spruce, dripping fir, granite outcrops slick with moss. The smell of wet earth and pine needles was strong, but underneath it lingered something sharper, metallic. They made good time at first, moving in silence. Each of them knew the terrain, knew the rules of travel. Keep a steady pace. Watch the ground for animal sign. Scan the tree line for movement. But it wasn't long before the first sign broke the rhythm. A deer carcass lay just off the trail, half hidden in the ferns. At a glance, it looked like a cougar kill. The throat was torn open, chest cavity split. But the cuts were too clean. They weren't ragged or uneven, like something with claws, killing to eat. They were done with intelligent precision. James crouched, pushing his glove against the torn hide. The edges of the wounds were dry. Not fresh, but not old either. "Cougar?" Isabel asked behind him. He shook his head. "Cougars kill, suffocate, drag. Eat the organs first. This is different." Evan stepped closer, studying the carcass with unsettling calm. "Something fed here," he said softly, "but not like any predator I've seen." James straightened slowly, watching him. "And how many predators have you seen exactly?" Evan looked at him, unreadable. "Enough." Before James could push, Thomas's voice cut through. "Leave it. We're burning daylight." They moved on. By midday, clouds had gathered again. The light dimmed, filtering green through the canopy. The forest grew thicker, the trail harder to follow. James hacked at blowdowns with his Pulaski, sweat dampening his collar despite the chill. They stopped once to check a remote game camera. The device was intact, the lens cracked but still functioning. Thomas swapped the memory card, slipping it into his breast pocket. "We'll check it back at Echo," he said. James's eyes lingered on the scratched casing. Something had raked across the camera, deep grooves etched into the plastic. Too clean, too even. His chest tightened. "Trail's splitting up ahead," Isabel called from point. Sure enough, the narrow cut forked around a ridge spur. One branch led east, climbing toward Pine Hollow. The other dipped into a gulch shadowed with alder and spruce. Thomas hesitated. Then, we take the high trail. Gulch is slower, wetter. We need speed. They started up the incline, James's legs working tirelessly as they climbed, boots slipping on wet rock. The higher they went, the stronger the wind grew, sighing through the timber like a restless voice. Halfway up, Thomas stopped suddenly, lifting a hand. James's stomach dropped. The forest went still. "Do you hear that?" Thomas asked softly. James held his breath. At first, nothing. Then, a sound, faint, carried on the wind. Not branches, not birds. A low, guttural hum, almost like a growl stretched into vibration. It rolled through the valley below, rising and falling. Then silence. "What the hell was that?" Isabel whispered. Thomas's jaw worked, but he said nothing. He only motioned them forward. James followed, every instinct screaming that they just brushed against something they weren't meant to hear. They made camp late in the afternoon, still miles from Pine Hollow. The ridge flattened into a small saddle, sheltered by rock outcrops. They pitched a tarp against the wind and huddled close, cooking instant noodles over the camp stove. Conversation was sparse. The forest seemed to lean in, listening. James sipped from his tin cup and kept his eyes on Evan, who sat apart sharpening his knife. Each pull of steel on stone scraped like a nerve in James's skull. The man hadn't flinched at the carcass, hadn't blinked at the growl in the valley. And when Thomas asked, "Do you hear that?" Evan seemed almost eager. James forced himself to look away. "Tomorrow we reach Pine Hollow by midday," Thomas said finally. His tone was steady, but his eyes were shadowed. "Whatever's there, we deal with it. Stick together. Nobody wanders." The rest nodded. Night fell heavy. The wind moaned across the ridge. James lay in his bag staring at the tarp above. Every sound amplified. The snap of branches, the hiss of the stove cooling, the slow, steady scrape of Evan's knife, even long after the others had quieted. Sleep came in fragments. Sometime near dawn, James woke to silence. Too much silence. The wind had died. The trees were still. Even the insects were quiet. He pushed himself up slowly, scanning the dark. The others were lumps under their tarps. Except Evan's bag was empty. James's pulse spiked. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The ridge was cloaked in pre-dawn gloom, the forest below a black ocean. "Evan?" he hissed. No answer. He moved toward the tree line, light cutting across the ground. That's when he saw it, a line of prints in the damp soil. At first they looked human, bare feet, long stride, but the toes were wrong, too long, too sharp, ending in gouges. The trail led down into the trees. James's breath caught in his throat. He raised the light higher and stopped. Something moved at the edge of the beam, a shape, tall and hunched, its skin glistening faintly in the dim light. For a heartbeat, the face turned toward him, eyes narrow, pale, inhuman. Then it was gone, melting into the trees without a sound. James stumbled back, heart hammering, the flashlight beam jerking wildly. When he turned, Evan stood behind him. "Can't sleep?" Evan asked, voice calm, knife glinting in his hand. James swallowed hard, forcing words past the dryness in his throat. "Where were you?" Evan smiled faintly. "Just stretching my legs." The prints were gone. The trees were still. James couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And in that moment, with Evan's eyes catching the first light of dawn, James wasn't sure if he was standing with his teammate or staring into the face of the thing that had stalked them all along. James didn't sleep again after that. Even after Evan returned to his bag and drifted into what looked like peaceful rest, James lay rigid in the cold, eyes locked on the tarp ceiling. His mind replayed what he'd seen, or thought he'd seen, at the tree line. The prints in the dirt, the glistening shape, the eyes. By dawn, when Thomas roused them, James was hollow-eyed and shaking from exhaustion. He didn't mention what he'd seen. He almost did when Isabel asked if he was all right, but the words caught in his throat. If he said it out loud, it would be real. And worse, he wasn't sure anyone would believe him. They broke camp and moved east, pushing hard. The trail narrowed into switchbacks that wound through thick spruce. The higher they climbed, the more the forest closed in, the branches knitting overhead until the light dimmed like dusk even at midday. Hours passed in the rhythm of boots and breath, the rasp of fabric, the occasional clatter of a loose stone down the slope. James's legs burned, his shoulders ached from the pack, but his mind kept circling back to Evan, walking a few paces ahead, moving easily as though the steep grade didn't touch him. At one point, Evan slowed to let James catch up. "You're dragging," he said softly, almost kindly. "Didn't sleep." James kept his eyes forward. Evan smiled faintly. "Dreams get worse up here. Old mountains. Old things. They leave impressions." James's skin prickled. "What kind of things?" Evan's gaze flicked sideways. "Unreadable. Depends on who's looking." Before James could respond, Thomas called for a halt. They'd reached a small clearing where the underbrush was trampled flat. The earth was churned with tracks, boots mostly, but also deer hooves and something else. Something deeper. Thomas crouched low, scanning the ground. He brushed aside leaves, following a drag mark that streaked across the soil like something heavy had been hauled. Isabel's face tightened. "That's not right." "No," Thomas agreed quietly. "It's not." He stood, motioning them onward, but James caught the shadow in his eyes. Whatever he'd seen, he recognized it, and it scared him. By late afternoon, the trail bent around a ridge and dropped into a basin. Pine Hollow Station sat at the far end, a squat log cabin tucked between the trees. Normally, the sight of it meant relief, shelter, warmth. Today it was silent. No smoke rose from the chimney. The flagpole out front was bare. The four of them froze at the tree line, scanning the station through binoculars. The windows were dark. The door hung slightly ajar. One of the solar panels had been smashed, glass glittering in the dirt. "Where are the vehicles?" Isabel asked. The gravel lot was empty. Thomas lowered his binoculars. "Stay sharp. Move in slow." They advanced carefully, rifles in hand. James's pulse thundered in his ears. Every step felt like crossing into enemy ground. The porch boards creaked as Thomas pushed the door fully open. The smell hit them instantly, copper and something sour, something like musk. Inside, the station was wrecked. Furniture overturned, papers scattered, a map pinned to the wall shredded with deep slashes. The radio console was smashed, wires yanked from the wall. "No bodies," Isabel whispered. "Jesus." Thomas's jaw tightened. He moved room to room, rifle raised, but the cabin was empty. Too empty. James trailed behind, every sense screaming. The place felt wrong, like the walls themselves were listening. He paused at a back window, looking out. The trees swayed in the wind, their shadows long in the dying light. For a second, he thought he saw movement, a flicker between the trunks. He blinked, and it was gone. They regrouped in the main room. "No sign of Morgan or the others," Thomas said grimly. "No gear, no packs, no notes left behind." "Maybe they ran," Isabel suggested, though her voice was thin. Thomas shook his head. "Not with the radio smashed. Someone wanted them cut off. That wasn't panic. That was deliberate." James swallowed. "Then where are they?" Silence answered. Evan crouched by the map table, studying the shredded surface. His fingers traced the gouges, long and precise. "Bear," he murmured. "Something marking territory?" James stared at him, then said, "Have you ever seen a bear do this?" Evan looked up, eyes pale in the dim light. "Maybe I have." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Thomas broke the tension. "We can't stay here. We'll sweep the perimeter, check for tracks. I'll call this in, then we head back before nightfall." Nobody argued. The sweep was worse than the cabin. Behind the station, the ground was torn up with drag marks leading into the forest. Shreds of clothing lay tangled in the brush, ranger uniform fabric, stained dark. A broken rifle barrel jutted from the mud like a snapped bone. James forced himself to keep walking, though his throat had closed tight. The farther they went, the more the signs mounted. Scratches gouged into tree trunks, spaced high, far higher than a bear could reach. Small pits dug into the soil, as if something had burrowed. And the silence. Not a bird, not a squirrel, not even the buzz of insects. The woods here were dead. When they regrouped at the cabin, Thomas's face was ashen. "We're pulling out," he said. "Now! We'll come back with more manpower, but not tonight." Relief flickered across Isabel's face. Even Evan didn't argue. They shouldered their packs and turned back toward the ridge. The sun was sinking fast, the trees darkening into silhouettes. James walked at the rear, rifle tight in his grip. His nerves hummed with every snap of twig, every shift of shadow. Halfway up the trail, he glanced back. The cabin stood silent, windows black. But in the tree line beyond, just for a heartbeat, he saw them. Shapes watching, tall, hunched, eyes glinting pale in the dusk. Then they stepped back, swallowed by the forest. James' breath caught in his throat. He wanted to shout, to warn the others, but the words froze. If he spoke, if he drew attention, would they come? He kept walking, every instinct screaming to run. They made camp in near darkness on the ridge. Nobody spoke as they pitched the tarp and lit a small fire. The woods pressed close around them, the silence unbroken. James sat with his back to a tree, rifle across his knees. He couldn't stop thinking of those shapes in the tree line, watching, waiting. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was low. "We're not dealing with animals. You all see that now." Isabel nodded mutely. James swallowed hard. "Then what the hell are we dealing with?" Thomas stared into the fire, the flames carving deep lines into his face. "Something old, something I've been tracking for years. I thought maybe I was wrong, but I'm not." Evan's eyes glimmered in the firelight. Then he smiled. James's skin crawled. He looked at Evan across the flames, the man's face half in shadow, and the thought came unbidden, cold as the night air. Maybe the enemy wasn't just out there in the trees. Maybe it was sitting by the fire with them. This is the end of Chapter 3. Thank you for listening. Subscribe for the next chapter.